You'll never make it without me. Those 6 words followed me for 8 years. I heard them the night my marriage ended, and even after the divorce papers were signed, those words stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. My name is Michael Bennett, and at 38 years old, I watched the person I loved most walk away believing I was a man without a future. Rachel did not say those words with anger. That was what made them hurt even more. She said them with certainty, like she had already decided the story of my life before I had the chance to finish writing it. Michael, you have good intentions, but intentions do not build a future, she told me that evening. You keep waiting for things to get better, but they never do. I remember sitting across from her at our kitchen table, looking at the same room where we had once planned our dreams together. The house was quiet. The coffee between us had gone cold. And for the first time, I realized that the person sitting in front of me was no longer fighting for our marriage. She had already left emotionally before she ever left physically. At that time, I was working a job that barely covered our expenses. I had ideas, plans, and goals, but I had also made mistakes. I was not the successful person I imagined I would become when I was younger. I understood why Rachel was disappointed. What I struggled to accept was the way she looked at me, as if my current situation was proof that I would never become anything more. I need a partner who is moving forward, she said quietly. I cannot keep waiting for someone who might change someday. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind her of every sacrifice I had made and every time I had tried. But deep down, I knew there was something I needed to learn. I had spent years hoping circumstances would change without truly changing myself. The divorce was painful, but the hardest part was not losing my wife. It was losing the version of myself who believed I still had unlimited time to figure everything out. After Rachel moved out, the house felt unfamiliar. The silence was everywhere. There was no one asking about my day, no one sharing small moments with me, and no one sitting beside me at the end of a long evening. For several weeks, I allowed myself to feel lost. I looked at old photographs and wondered when we had stopped being the couple who believed they could overcome anything. But eventually, I realized something important. Rachel's words had hurt me, but they also forced me to look honestly at my own life. I could spend years trying to prove she was wrong, or I could become someone I respected regardless of what anyone else believed. I chose the second option. I started with small changes. I woke up earlier. I organized my finances. I learned new skills after work. I stopped making excuses for the things I had avoided. Nobody noticed at first. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly changed. There was just one decision after another, one small improvement after another. Slowly, the person looking back at me in the mirror began to feel different. The most surprising part was that I was not becoming someone new to impress Rachel. I was becoming someone I should have been for myself all along. Months passed, then years. I built a life that I once thought was impossible. I created opportunities one never imagined. I surrounded myself with people who valued effort, honesty, and growth. But even after everything changed, I never forgot that night. Not because I was angry at Rachel, but because those words became the beginning of a journey I never expected to take. 8 years later, I would hear her voice again. I would see her face again, and she would finally meet the man she once believed would never succeed. The first year after my divorce was the hardest because I had to learn how to live without the identity I had built around being a husband. For nearly a decade, every decision I made included Rachel. We planned weekends together, discussed our future, and believed we were building a life that would last. When that disappeared, I had to face a difficult truth. I had spent so much time trying to create a future with someone else that I had forgotten to build one for myself. The early mornings were the hardest. I would wake up before my alarm, expecting to hear Rachel moving around the house or preparing coffee in the kitchen. Then reality would return, and I would remember that I was alone. Instead of allowing that loneliness to define me, I decided to use it as motivation. I started by making small promises to myself and keeping them. I promised I would stop avoiding difficult decisions. I promised I would become more disciplined. I promised I would take responsibility for the parts of my life that needed improvement. I did not become successful overnight. There was no single moment when everything changed. The transformation happened quietly, through hundreds of ordinary choices that nobody else saw. I took online business courses after work. I read books about leadership and financial planning. I started meeting people who challenged me to think differently. For years, I had told myself that I was capable of more, but I had never created the habits necessary to prove it. That changed after Rachel left. I stopped waiting for confidence to appear and started building it through action. About 2 years after the divorce, I took a risk and started my own consulting company. It was something I had talked about during my marriage, but never had the courage to pursue. Rachel used to tell me that dreams were not enough. At the time, I thought she was being unfair. Later, I realized there was some truth in her words. Dreams need effort behind them. Hope needs action. I just wished I had understood that sooner. The difference was that I no longer wanted success because I wanted to prove Rachel wrong. I wanted success because I finally understood my own potential. The company grew slowly. There were difficult months when I questioned whether I had made the right choice. There were nights when I worked until midnight and wondered if anyone would ever notice. But every challenge taught me something. I learned patience. I learned responsibility. I learned that progress does not always look impressive while it is happening. Sometimes growth is simply showing up every day and refusing to quit. By the 5th year after my divorce, my life looked completely different. I moved into a comfortable home outside Denver, Colorado. I had a team of people who trusted me. I was financially stable. More importantly, I was at peace with myself. I no longer measured my worth by whether someone else believed in me. I had learned to believe in myself first. Occasionally, I wondered what Rachel would think if she saw my life now. Not because I wanted her approval, but because a small part of me was curious whether she would recognize the person I had become. Still, I never searched for her. I never tried to show her what she had missed. The greatest lesson I learned was that proving someone wrong keeps you connected to the past. Building a better life allows you to finally move forward. 8 years passed. My life continued in ways I never expected. I met new people, created new friendships, and discovered interests I had ignored for years. The man who walked away from that divorce was uncertain and afraid. The man I became was someone I respected. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning, while attending a business event in downtown Denver, I saw a familiar face across the room. At first, I thought my memory was playing tricks on me. But then she turned around, and I recognized her immediately. After 8 years apart, I was standing in the same room as Rachel again. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The room around us continued moving. People talking, glasses clinking, and business conversations happening at tables nearby, but it felt like everything had slowed down. 8 years had passed since the last time I saw Rachel, yet somehow my mind immediately remembered every detail of that final evening we shared. The kitchen table, the quiet house, the words that changed everything. But standing there in that conference room, I realized something surprising. I was not the same person who had walked away from that marriage. And Rachel was not the same person who had walked away from me. She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. "Michael," she finally said. I nodded. "Rachel, it has been a long time." Her expression softened. It really has. There was no anger in her voice. No criticism. Just two people who once knew each other better than anyone else and were now trying to understand who they had become. She asked how I had been, and I gave her the simple answer. I have been good. I could have told her about the company, the projects, the growth, and all the things that had changed over the years. But something inside me did not want to turn the conversation into a demonstration. I had spent too much time learning that my worth did not come from impressing someone else. Rachel noticed that. "You seem different," she said. I smiled slightly. "I am different." Those words felt more meaningful than any explanation I could have given. Because the truth was, I had not just changed my circumstances. I had changed the way I saw myself. We found a quiet table away from the crowd and sat down for a few minutes. At first, the conversation stayed simple. We talked about where we lived, our careers, and the people we had met along the way. Rachel told me she was still working in marketing and had moved to a smaller home outside the city. She mentioned that life had not turned out exactly as she expected. I listened without judgment. After all, 8 years had taught me that everyone carries experiences other people cannot see. Eventually, the conversation reached the subject we both knew was waiting: the divorce. Rachel looked down at her coffee cup before speaking. "I have thought about that night many times." I stayed quiet. "I was very certain about everything back then," she continued. "I thought I knew exactly what kind of future you would have." Her words were different now. There was no confidence behind them, only reflection. "You probably hated me for saying those things." I shook my head. "No, I was hurt. There is a difference." She looked surprised by my answer. I continued. For a long time, I thought I needed to prove you wrong. But eventually I realized that was not the life I wanted to build. I needed to become better for myself, not because someone doubted me. Rachel looked at me quietly. That is what I noticed when I saw you walk in today, she said. You are not trying to prove anything. I appreciated that she understood. The old Michael would have wanted her to see every achievement and regret her decision. The new Michael simply wanted to have an honest conversation. Before we left the event, Rachel asked if we could talk again sometime. I agreed. Not because I was hoping to rebuild what we had lost, and not because I wanted an apology. I agreed because after 8 years, I no longer needed the past to be different. I only wanted to understand it. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how strange life can be. The person who once told me I would fail had returned at a time when I no longer needed anyone to tell me I had succeeded. I had spent years becoming someone I respected, and that was the one thing no one could take away from me. But I also knew our conversation was not finished. There were still questions between us. There were still memories we had never discussed. And somewhere beneath the years of distance, there was a story about two people who had once loved each other but had not known how to grow together. The next time Rachel and I met, it was not at a crowded business event surrounded by people who knew nothing about our history. It was at a small coffee shop near downtown Denver, the kind of place where people could sit for hours talking without feeling rushed. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be present for the conversation. 8 years earlier, I would have walked into that meeting carrying 1,000 questions and a desire for answers. The person I was then would have wanted Rachel to understand every way her words had affected me. But the person I had become understood something different. Sometimes closure does not come from making someone admit they were wrong. Sometimes closure comes from understanding why things happened the way they did. When Rachel arrived, she smiled and sat across from me. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, remembering a life that felt both familiar and distant. I have wanted to talk to you for a long time, she said. I nodded. So have I. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked toward the window. I have thought about the night we ended our marriage more times than I can count. I listened carefully. This was the conversation we had avoided for 8 years. I was convinced that leaving was the only choice, she continued. At the time, I thought I was being realistic. I thought I was protecting myself from a future where I would always be disappointed. Her honesty surprised me. The Rachel I remembered from that night was certain and confident. This Rachel seemed like someone who had spent years reflecting on her decisions. I want you to know something, she said. When I told you that you would fail, I was not just talking about your career. I was talking about the fear I had about our life together. I thought if things were difficult then, they would only become harder later. I looked down at my coffee for a moment. Hearing those words did not erase the pain from the past, but it helped me see the situation from another perspective. I wish you had told me you felt that way, I said. I wish we had talked instead of deciding everything was already over. Rachel nodded slowly. I know. That is something I regret. There was a quiet moment between us. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. The kind that happens when two people finally stop defending their past choices and start understanding them. I told her about the years after our divorce. I told her about struggling, learning, and rebuilding my confidence. I told her that the hardest part was not losing the marriage. It was believing for a while that maybe she was right about me. But she was wrong, Rachel said softly. I looked at her. What? I was wrong about you, she repeated. I saw where you were at that moment and assumed that was where you would always be. I did not see the person you could become. Those words were something the younger version of me would have desperately wanted to hear. But sitting there 8 years later, they did not feel like a victory. They simply felt honest. The truth is, I said, I needed to change too. I cannot blame everything on you. I had dreams, but I was not doing enough to turn them into reality. Rachel smiled slightly. That is probably what makes this conversation different. We are not trying to decide who was the villain. I agreed. Life had taught me that most relationships do not end because one person is completely right and the other is completely wrong. Sometimes two people become lost in their own fears and stop seeing each other clearly. Before we left, Rachel asked me a question I did not expect. Are you happy now? I smiled. Yes, I really am. She nodded, and I could tell that answer mattered to her. Not because she wanted credit for my growth, but because she finally understood that I had built a life beyond the moment when she left. As I walked back to my car, I realized something important. The greatest change over those 8 years was not my career my home, or my achievements. It was the fact that I could sit across from the person who once hurt me and feel peace instead of resentment. But I also knew this conversation had opened another door. Because forgiveness was one thing, understanding what we wanted from the future was something else entirely. After my conversation with Rachel, I expected to feel a sense of relief. In some ways, I did. For years, I had carried the weight of that final conversation in our marriage, replaying every word and wondering what I could have done differently. Hearing her acknowledge her mistakes helped me release some of the questions I had carried for so long. But there was something else I realized as I drove home that evening. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting what happened. It means accepting the past without allowing it to control your future. For the first time, I was able to look back at my marriage without only remembering the ending. I started remembering the beginning too. I remembered the woman Rachel was when we first met. She was confident, intelligent, and full of dreams. We used to spend hours talking about the future, imagining the places we would visit and the life we would create together. Those memories were real. The love we shared was real. The fact that we eventually lost our way did not erase the years when we were happy. A few weeks after our coffee shop conversation, Rachel and I met again. This time, the conversation felt easier. There was less hesitation between us. We were no longer two people trying to explain why we had made certain choices. We were two people trying to understand the people we had become. Rachel told me about the years after the divorce. She admitted that the life she imagined after leaving was not as simple as she expected. She had believed that removing the struggles from our marriage would automatically create happiness. Instead, she discovered that every person carries their own challenges wherever they go. I thought leaving would solve everything, she said quietly. But I eventually realized I was also running away from things I needed to face within myself. I appreciated her honesty because it showed growth. The Rachel sitting across from me was not the same person who had ended our marriage 8 years earlier. Just like I was not the same man she had left behind. I told her that one of the biggest lessons I learned was that success alone does not heal every wound. When my company began growing and my life became more stable, I thought those achievements would completely erase the pain from the past. They did not. Accomplishments can create confidence, but they cannot replace understanding. I spent years thinking I needed to prove something, I told her. Eventually, I realized the only person I needed to prove something to was myself. Rachel smiled. That is probably the biggest difference I see in you now. Before, you wanted everyone to believe in you. Now, you already believe in yourself. Her words made me think about the journey I had taken. The greatest change was not that I had become more successful. It was that I no longer needed success to define my worth. Over the next few months, Rachel and I continued having occasional conversations. We did not rush into rebuilding the relationship we once had. We both understood that 8 years apart could not simply disappear. Instead, we focused on creating something different. A connection built on honesty instead of expectations. One afternoon, we visited a park where we used to walk when we were first married. The trees had grown taller. The paths looked different. But being there reminded me that time changes everything, including the way we see our own memories. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had handled things differently? Rachel asked. I thought about the question carefully. The younger version of me would have said yes immediately. He would have wished for a different ending. But the person I had become understood something more complicated. Sometimes, I answered. But I also think we both needed to become the people we are now. Rachel looked at me and nodded. Neither of us knew what the future would bring. We were not trying to recreate the past or pretend the divorce never happened. We were simply two people who had once lost their way and were now choosing to understand each other. As I walked back to my car that afternoon, I realized something I had never expected. The person who once made me question my future had become someone I could finally have an honest conversation with. But the next question was no longer whether Rachel regretted leaving. The real question was whether two people who had changed so much could find a new way to connect without losing everything they had learned along the way. The months after Rachel and I began speaking again taught me something I never expected. Sometimes rebuilding trust is not about returning to the way things were. Sometimes it is about accepting that the old version of a relationship has ended and creating something healthier from the lessons learned. For years, I believed the only way to move forward was to leave the past behind completely. But I discovered that understanding the past could actually help me appreciate the present. Rachel and I continued meeting occasionally. Sometimes we talked for hours about our lives after the divorce. Other times, we simply shared coffee and talked about ordinary things. There was no pressure to define what we were becoming. We were both aware that the foundation of our relationship had changed forever. The marriage we once had belonged to another chapter of our lives. If we were going to build any kind of connection again, it had to be based on who we were now, not who we had been 8 years earlier. One evening, Rachel asked if I would help her move a few boxes from her apartment into a storage unit. It was a simple favor, but as we carried those boxes together, I noticed something familiar. We were communicating easily. We were making decisions together. We were laughing about small things that once felt natural between us. The difference was that this time, neither of us was pretending everything was perfect. We understood each other's flaws because we had already experienced what happened when we ignored them. While organizing her belongings, Rachel found an old photo album. She sat down on the floor and started turning through the pages. Inside were pictures from the early years of our marriage. There were vacations, family gatherings, and simple moments that neither of us remembered until we saw them again. "We really were happy, weren't we?" she asked. I looked at the photographs and nodded. Yes, we were. That answer surprised her. She looked at me quietly. "I thought maybe you only remembered the bad parts." I smiled. For a while I did. But eventually, I realized one painful ending should not erase an entire story. Those words were important because they represented how much I had changed. The younger version of me wanted to label the past as a failure. He wanted to believe the marriage ending meant everything before it had been meaningless. But life had taught me something different. Some relationships do not fail because there was no love. Sometimes people fail because they do not know how to handle change, pressure, and personal struggles together. Rachel became more open about her own regrets. She admitted that after our divorce, she spent a long time convincing herself she had made the right decision because admitting doubt felt too difficult. "I was so focused on what I thought I was losing by staying that I never considered what I might lose by leaving," she said. I appreciated her honesty because it was not an attempt to change the past. It was simply an acknowledgement of what happened. I told her that I also had regrets. I regretted not listening better. I regretted allowing my fear of failure to prevent me from taking action sooner. I regretted believing that love alone could solve problems without communication and effort. But I also knew something important. We could not spend the rest of our lives punishing ourselves for choices made by people we no longer were. One weekend, we attended a small gathering with some old friends. Several people who knew us before the divorce were surprised to see us together. They asked questions, but neither Rachel nor I felt the need to explain every detail. We simply said we were catching up and reconnecting. That was the truth. We were learning how to know each other again without the expectations that once created so much pressure. Later that evening, Rachel and I stood outside looking at the city lights. "I never thought we would be here," she said. I smiled. Neither did I. There was a peacefulness between us that had not existed before. Not because all the old problems disappeared, but because we were no longer trying to be the people we thought we were supposed to be. We were simply two people who had grown, changed, and learned from the past. As I drove home that night, I realized the biggest surprise was not seeing Rachel again after 8 years. The biggest surprise was discovering that the person I once thought was responsible for my pain had also become part of my understanding of growth. But I also knew the next step would require something even more difficult than forgiveness. It would require deciding what kind of future two changed people could realistically create together. The question of what came next was not something Rachel and I could answer in one conversation. We had spent 8 years becoming different people, and we both understood that rebuilding something meaningful required patience. The easiest choice would have been to look backward and wonder what might have happened if we had made different decisions. But we had both learned that life does not move in reverse. The only thing we could control was how we treated each other in the present. A few weeks after our conversation, Rachel invited me to dinner. It was not a romantic gesture, and neither of us treated it that way. It was simply two people sharing a meal and continuing a conversation that had been interrupted years earlier. We chose a small restaurant near the park where we used to walk when we were newly married. Sitting across from her, I noticed something I had not expected. I felt comfortable. There was no need to impress her. No need to prove that I had succeeded. No need to remind her of the things she had once doubted. The man who sat across from Rachel that evening was not the same man who had left their marriage feeling defeated. He no longer needed validation from the person who had once questioned his future. During dinner, Rachel asked me something that made me pause. "Do you think you ever truly forgave me?" I thought carefully before answering. "I think I forgave you when I stopped needing you to feel guilty." She looked at me quietly. I continued. "For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant pretending I was not hurt. But I eventually learned that forgiveness means accepting what happened and choosing not to carry that pain every day." Rachel nodded slowly. I wish I had understood that back then. I believe she meant it. Not because she was trying to change the past, but because her actions over the previous months showed a different person. She listened more. She asked questions instead of making assumptions. She acknowledged things she once refused to see. Those small changes meant more than any dramatic apology. Over time, I began to understand something about our divorce. Rachel had not left because she stopped caring about me. She left because she believed the version of life we had created was not the life she wanted anymore. The problem was that she judged my future based only on my struggles at that moment. She could not see the growth that had not happened yet. But I also had to accept my own responsibility. I had expected Rachel to believe in my potential while I had not fully believed in myself. I had wanted her support without doing enough to become the person I said I wanted to be. Both of us had lessons to learn. One afternoon, we visited the neighborhood where we first lived after getting married. The small house looked different after all those years. The trees were taller, the paint had changed, and the streets seemed smaller than we remembered. But walking there reminded me that every chapter of life leaves something behind. I used to think leaving this place meant leaving that version of myself behind. Rachel said. I smiled. Maybe we both needed to leave that version behind. We stood there quietly for a moment, looking at a place that represented both happiness and difficulty. It was strange how one location could hold so many emotions at the same time. Over the following months, Rachel and I continued spending time together. We did not make promises we were not ready to keep. We did not rush because we were afraid of being alone. Instead, we allowed trust to grow naturally. We focused on the simple things that had been missing before. Honest conversations. Listening without preparing a response. Asking questions instead of assuming we already knew the answers. One evening, Rachel admitted something that surprised me. I used to think I left because I was stronger than you. Now I think I left because I was afraid. I looked at her and realized how much honesty that sentence contained. Strength is not always walking away. Sometimes strength is admitting when you misunderstood something important. As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey that brought us there. 8 years earlier, I believed my life had ended when my marriage ended. I believed I had lost the person who knew me best. But life had shown me something different. Sometimes losing what you thought you needed creates space for you to discover who you truly are. And sometimes, after you become that person, the past returns not to reopen old wounds, but to show you how much you have changed. As time passed, I began to realize that the most important part of our journey was not whether Rachel and I would become a couple again. The most important part was that we had finally learned how to understand each other. For years, we had looked at our marriage through the lens of disappointment. She saw a future that frightened her. I saw a person who had stopped believing in me. Both of us carried our own version of the story, and both of us believed we were the only ones who had been hurt. But after 8 years apart, we finally learned to listen. That changed everything. Rachel and I continued spending time together, but we did so differently than before. There was no pressure to recreate our old marriage. There were no promises made simply because we missed the comfort of familiarity. Instead, we focused on building trust one moment at a time. I noticed small things that showed how much she had changed. She asked about my thoughts instead of assuming she already knew them. She listened when I talked about my experiences. She admitted when she was wrong. Those things might seem simple, but after years of feeling misunderstood, they meant more than grand gestures ever could. I also had to be honest with myself. It would have been easy to believe that I had changed completely while Rachel was the only one who needed to grow. But that was not true. I had my own mistakes. During our marriage, I often focused on my goals without realizing how my uncertainty affected the person beside me. I wanted Rachel to believe in my dreams, but I did not always show her that I believed in them myself. Growth requires admitting uncomfortable truths, and I had learned that avoiding responsibility only keeps people trapped in the same patterns. One evening, Rachel and I sat outside a small cafe after dinner. The weather was cool, and people walked along the street enjoying the evening. It was an ordinary moment, but I remember it clearly because of what she said. Michael, I used to think success was about proving people wrong. I think I finally understand that it is about becoming someone you are proud of. I smiled because those words reflected the lesson I had spent years learning. I agree, I said. The best thing that happened after our divorce was that I stopped trying to win an argument that no longer mattered. Rachel looked at me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever wish we had met again sooner? I considered the question carefully. The old version of me would have said yes. He would have wished for a chance to fix everything before so much time passed. But I was not that person anymore. I think we met when we were ready to actually hear each other. I answered. Maybe earlier, we would have repeated the same mistakes. She nodded quietly. There was wisdom in accepting that timing matters. Sometimes people can love each other and still not know how to treat each other well. Sometimes distance creates the perspective that closeness could not provide. A few weeks later, Rachel attended a small celebration for my company. She saw the team I had built and the people who had become part of my life. But what surprised me was not that she noticed my success. It was that she noticed the person behind it. You seem happier than I have ever seen you, she said. I smiled. That is because I finally stopped waiting for someone else to make me feel complete. That sentence was the truth I had spent years discovering. No relationship, no achievement, and no outside approval can replace the importance of knowing yourself. As the evening ended, Rachel and I walked toward our cars. She paused before leaving and said, I am grateful we had this chance. I nodded. So am I. There was no sadness in that moment. No unfinished argument. No need to rewrite history. Just appreciation for two people who had grown through a difficult chapter. Looking back, I realized that the greatest victory was never becoming successful after someone doubted me. The greatest victory was becoming someone who no longer needed to be defined by another person's opinion. The words Rachel said years earlier had once felt like a prediction of my future. Now, they were simply a reminder of how far I had traveled. And the person standing there was no longer trying to prove he would not fail. He was simply grateful for the life he had built. 1 year after Rachel and I reconnected, I found myself sitting in the same park where we had once talked about our future as a young married couple. The trees were taller, the city around us had changed, and we were different people than the ones who had walked those paths years before. But as I watched the people passing by and listened to the sounds around me, I realized something important. The story of my life was never about proving someone wrong. It was about discovering who I was when I stopped needing anyone else to define me. Rachel sat beside me quietly, holding a cup of coffee in her hands. We had reached a place where silence no longer felt uncomfortable. That was something we never had before. In the past, silence between us often meant there were things we were avoiding. Now, silence meant we were comfortable simply being present with each other. I think I spent a long time believing our divorce was the biggest mistake of my life, Rachel said. I looked at her, but did not interrupt. But now I think it was a painful lesson we both needed. It forced us to grow in ways we probably would not have if we had stayed the same. I nodded because I understood exactly what she meant. The divorce had been one of the most difficult experiences of my life, but it had also pushed me toward becoming a person I respected. It taught me patience. It taught me responsibility. Most importantly, it taught me that nobody else can create your sense of worth. You have to build that within yourself. Rachel and I eventually decided to give our relationship another chance, but this time we approached it differently. We were not trying to recreate the past. We were not pretending the years apart had never happened. We were two people choosing each other again with a better understanding of who we were. There were still conversations we needed to have. There were still things we had to learn about each other. But the difference was that we no longer approached challenges as opponents. We approached them as partners. Months later, we took a weekend trip to a small mountain town in Colorado. It was not an expensive vacation or a dramatic gesture. It was simply two people enjoying time together and appreciating the life they had built. While walking through the town, Rachel stopped near a small bookstore and smiled. Do you remember when we used to say we would travel more someday? She asked. I laughed. Yes, we had a lot of plans. She smiled. We did. Then she looked at me and added, maybe we were just waiting to become the people who could actually enjoy them. That sentence stayed with me because it represented everything we had learned. Sometimes life does not give you the exact path you expected. Sometimes it takes you through disappointment, uncertainty, and change before you understand what truly matters. Years earlier, I thought losing my marriage meant losing my future. I Thought the person who walked away had taken something from me that I could never recover. But I was wrong. My future was never something another person could take away. It was something I had to create. Today, when I think about that night 8 years ago, I no longer remember only the pain. I remember the beginning of a transformation. I remember the moment when I had to decide whether I would stay stuck in what I lost or move toward what I could become. Rachel's words once made me question myself, but my journey afterward taught me something much more valuable than proving her wrong. It taught me how to believe in myself. The greatest success in life is not showing someone that they underestimated you. The greatest success is reaching a place where their opinion no longer controls your happiness. Looking back now, I am grateful for the lessons hidden inside that difficult chapter. I am grateful for the years that shaped me, the challenges that strengthened me, and the opportunity to meet Rachel again as two completely different people. Because sometimes the person who leaves your life creates the space you need to find yourself. And sometimes, when life brings two people together again, it is not to repeat the past. It is to finally understand it.